Okay, part C of lecture 6, Money and Gold in medieval Africa. Let's start at the Horn of Africa in what is today Ethiopia. Beginning in the 1st century BC, extending through the 10th century, there was a kingdom, sometimes referred to as an empire, called the Aximite Empire, or the Kingdom of Axum, and it was centered in this city here. You see located there, Axum. Sometimes you'll see it spelled A-X-U-M. But its chief prominence, its peak was around the 3rd century A.D. through the 6th century, and it served as a very critical trade hub between the Mediterranean and India, owing to its access to the Red Sea. For a long time, Mediterranean access to India went through Persia, but increasingly by the 1st century AD, the Romans preferred the Red Sea route. Of course, there was no Suez Canal back then, so you had to go through Egypt and then access the Red Sea through there. And the Aximite control of this region afforded them quite a lot of power. Their access to the Red Sea and then their access to the Upper Nile permitted this kingdom to build quite a strong navy and commercial connections with the Mediterranean and also with the Indian world, buying and selling goods, and again flourishing primarily in the 4th through 6th or 7th centuries. This kingdom, they adopted the name Ethiopian around the 4th century AD, and they were also a Christian empire. The ruler, King Azana, in the early part of the 4th century, converted to Christianity, and tradition claims actually that the Ark of the Covenant to this day still resides in Axum. The Queen of Sheba was said to come from this area as well. At the peak of Axumite power, the Aximite Kingdom also controlled Yemen, the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Actually, it was formerly controlled by a Jewish king who had persecuted Christians there, and the Christian king of Axum invaded and overthrew that kingdom and established control over the Arabian Peninsula, further solidifying Axumite control of the Mediterranean to Indian routes. The Aximite Kingdom was known for its what were called stela, which were these very, very tall gravestones with markings on them, obelisk as well. This was a stone, a marker from King Azana describing his conquests as well as his conversion to Christianity. There's some ruins of various stela. But Axum became a bustling commercial center. Today it's a relatively small village, but for a while it was quite a trading hub. The Ethiopian people not only traded in Eastern commodities, the silk and the spices, so forth, but also exported gold. We'll see that in a moment. In fact, there were extensive gold deposits in Ethiopia as well as in parts of Sudan. Exported gold, ivory, emeralds to the Mediterranean into the Middle East. Here's some ruins and a reconstruction of what this particular palace looked like in Axum. Here's a map of some old world trading routes. So you see there, kind of Europe is on it. If you have Europe on the periphery and then China on the other end, India, you have the overland routes, the Silk Road, and then the Red Sea route. So you can see why, for a period here, there would be the Ethiopian Kingdom. You have a thriving commercial civilization. Well, in the 3rd century, the Ethiopians adopt a coinage, and here it is. This is actually a 4th century coinage by King Azana, and it is the first coinage to feature the Christian cross. You see the cross there. So something you don't hear about much. This was the foundation of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. There's another cross there, and King Izana. A gold coinage, although there were some silver coins. But Ethiopian access to gold, lots and lots of gold. And so these were predominantly used for international trade. And so one of the purposes of these coins was to spread the message that this is a powerful civilization, powerful empire, and a coinage attested to that. On some of the old coins, I'm trying to see if I have any here, I should, there are Greek letters in order to, so that Greek-speaking peoples in the Eastern Mediterranean would also have access to this information about this empire. Here's some silver coins. This is a baser, more of a small change coin used internally within Ethiopia. Made a strong empire for, oh, another thing I have down here in my notes. These were very fine coins too, 90% gold, 90% gold. Oh, not a debased coinage. Ethiopia was fairly strong into the 6th century, but by the late 6th century, early 7th century began to decline a bit as the Islamic caliphates in the 7th century consolidated power and expanded their rule. This is actually a depiction of in 615, the first hijra or pilgrimage of Muhammad's early followers. They were being persecuted in Mecca, and so they fled to Axum for refuge, and the Christian emperor welcomed them in. They had various theological discussions and disputes, but ended up on friendly terms, friendly relations. But ultimately, within a couple decades, the Islamic Caliphate had expanded so rapidly that they controlled the Red Sea area, controlled Egypt, actually took over some of the other Christian kingdoms in Sudan. In 640, the Islamic Caliphate actually attacked Adulis. They were pushed back, but it went a long way in not quite destroying, but in harming the Axum navy. And so, beginning in the mid to late 7th century, the decline. Axum is abandoned, and the Ethiopians push further inward, and that was the end of that. Moving west on the African continent, we have some medieval African kingdoms in the Sahel region, and for our purposes in this History of Money class, very, very important. Now, the Sahel are the grasslands just south of the Sahara Desert. Now, the Sahara Desert, here's the Sahel. Sahara Desert, enormous handicap, geographically speaking, for Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at why is it that Sub-Saharan Africa seems so just isolated and behind the rest of the old world, geography played a huge, massive role in this. The Sahara Desert is roughly the size of the 48 states here in the United States. Huge, huge expanse. And so what you had essentially was this entire Sub-Saharan part of the African continent totally cut off from the old world where ideas were shared between different civilizations. We've seen that in these first several lectures, the importance of the exchange of ideas. That was lost to Sub-Saharan Africa for many centuries. Ethiopia is able to benefit from its access to the Red Sea, but as far as much of Sub-Saharan Africa, that was not the case. Nigeria was a little different in this area here. In Nigeria, nearby the Gold Coast, peoples benefited from, of course, the Niger River and some of its tributaries and large iron deposits, so that region had begun to produce iron earlier than any other part of Sub-Saharan Africa. And it was also in this region massive, massive gold deposits. And you see a few of them here. And in fact, almost one half, during the medieval period, almost one half of the world's gold came from this region. Just massive, massive gold deposits. And it's located here. So what happened in the beginning in the, especially in the early part of the second millennium, but around 1000, maybe around 1000 AD, a succession of different Sahelian kingdoms in this region began opening up access, as difficult as it was, across the Sahara Desert to the rest of the world. And you see a few of those routes that were opened up. Timbuktu being the center of the Mali Empire, which we'll see here in a moment, trading gold and slaves across the Sahara Desert to the Middle East. Gold and slaves were the two main exports from this region. Here's a picture of Timbuktu around the late medieval period. A drawing of Timbuktu. And on occasion, Arabian merchants came to visit. Usually, that traffic was undertaken by merchants belonging to the Mali Empire. As I noted, the slave trade flourished as well. The estimates are anywhere between 10 to 18 million Africans were traded across the Sahara Desert to the Middle East, to the Arab merchants in the Islamic caliphates. Some estimates are as high as 25 million over about 1,000-year period carried across the Sahara Desert to the Middle East. This is a map of the major slave trade routes of the medieval period. Up there to North Africa, traded in some of those North African markets, in Egyptian, and then onward. And there was some going on in East Africa too. Arab merchants going down to East Africa, purchasing slaves from East Africa. The most prominent of these medieval African empires in this area of Africa was the Mali Empire. And I've already mentioned Timbuktu. Mali Empire situated along the Niger River. Mali Empire had extraordinary wealth, again owing to access to this gold, but also a flourishing culture. It was predominantly Islamic. So unlike the Ethiopian Empire, this is an Islamic empire. And here's a few artifacts from the period. And there was an emperor of the Mali Empire. Most famous of these emperors was Mansa Musa. Mansa was the title. So Musa I reigned for a little more, about a quarter century. And he is one of the richest men in world history. And in fact, if you were to calculate his wealth in today's dollars, it was about $400 billion. The Mansa claimed ownership of all the gold in the area. The gold nuggets were the exclusive property of the Mansa. He taxed the gold and then returned to whoever had mined the gold. Oops, there's my phone. Excuse me. Returned to whoever had mined the gold a bag of gold dust. I'll get to that in a moment. They became very, very wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy. And in fact, like I said, he was a devout Muslim, and so he made a pilgrimage, decided to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. This was in 324. And on his pilgrimage, he brought with him 60,000 men. Oh, it's one of the most famous voyages in the medieval period. 60,000 men coming from Timbuktu, 12,000 slaves, 12,000 of whom were slaves, and each slave carried 4 pounds of gold bars. So 4 pounds of gold bars carried by each slave, 12,000 slaves, in Mansa Musa's expedition. He passed through Cairo, and at Cairo, as a way, sort of a way to display his wealth, he ordered his men to spend the gold on souvenirs and other items, and it ended up causing a pretty big crash in the Egyptian economy, but owing to all the new gold that was thrown into circulation, caused massive inflation. But anyway, as I said, actually you weren't allowed to use gold nuggets as currency within the Mali Empire. It belonged to Mansa, and then he returned to you a bag of gold dust, and the gold dust was weighed for use every time. It was weighed and then bagged, and then that was what you could use as currency. But most, and one of the reasons why this was done, not only because it profited the emperor, but also because there was a fear that if you just let gold freely circulate in the Mali Empire, there was so much of it that it would become almost practically useless. There were no coins in the Mali Empire, just the bagged gold dust. Also, many of the common people used cowrie shells. And how did they obtain cowrie shells? If cowrie shells primarily came from Maldives, they obtained them from Arab merchants in the slave trade. So when the Mali Empire traded slaves across the Sahara Desert to Arab merchants, oftentimes the Arab merchants paid them in cowrie shells, and the cowrie shells were then brought back to West Africa and used as currency. And then another item of currency that was used by common people was salt. And salt was a very, very scarce commodity, and yet it was needed for the diet. And in fact, in some places, especially in the southern part of the Mali Empire, salt was more valuable than gold because there was so much gold, and yet salt was very scarce and yet very necessary. Cowrie shells, if you move a little further in Central Africa, cowrie shells also made way down into Central Africa and were used for decorative pieces, for jewelry, and also for currency. And to this day, the cowrie shell is valued in many African cultures for ornamental purposes. All right, that rounds that up. Next lecture, lecture number 7, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look into India and then especially China, the birth of paper money. Can you believe it? We're going to get the paper money next lecture number 7. See you then. Bye.